Imagine a world on the brink of transformation, where whispers of rebellion fill the streets, and determined colonists stand face to face with an imperial power they once admired. The stage is set for a dramatic showdown that will reshape the course of history. This is the story of the American Revolution, the road to rebellion. Strap in, because over the next half hour, we're diving deep into the turbulent era that lit the spark of liberty and fueled the birth of a nation. Welcome, history enthusiasts. Tonight, we embark on a journey back to the mid-18th century, a time when the American colonies were thriving under British rule, at least on the surface. Underneath the colonial prosperity, a growing rift was taking shape, one that would erupt into the American Revolution. In this documentary-style exploration, we'll uncover the seeds of discontent, trace the footsteps of outspoken patriots, and witness the fateful moments that sent shockwaves through the colonies. From the Stamp Act to the Boston Tea Party, from taxes on paper and sugar to the formidable presence of red-coated British soldiers, every pivotal event set the stage for rebellion. Our story unfolds against the backdrop of cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, where daily life collided with a swirl of political turmoil. By the end, you'll have a deeper understanding of the sacrifices, the triumphs, and the unstoppable momentum that propelled 13 colonies toward independence. So let's dig into the complexities, the bravery, and even the chaos that brought about a new world order. Get ready for an in-depth look at the road to rebellion. To understand how a cluster of British colonies transformed into a united front demanding independence, we have to explore life in colonial America. In the mid-1700s, these colonies, stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south, were home to people of varied backgrounds: farmers, merchants, artisans, and laborers. They lived under the protective umbrella of the British Crown, benefiting from trade links that delivered goods across the Atlantic. However, British mercantilist policies also dictated how the colonies could trade, restricting many to only do business with the mother country. While colonial markets flourished, a palpable tension brewed over limitations on local industry and commerce. Even as they identified as British subjects, colonists enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy through their local assemblies and town halls. This semi-independent spirit would soon clash with Parliament's attempts to recover debts from the costly French and Indian War. The British logic was straightforward: the colonies had benefited from military protection, so they should contribute financially. But the colonists were quick to see the difference between an ally defending shared interests and an empire imposing taxes without fair representation. This gap between expectation and reality, between colonists' views of themselves and Parliament's view of them, laid the first stones on the road to rebellion. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, part of the wider 7 Years' War, dramatically altered the geopolitical map of North America. While Britain emerged victorious, the cost was enormous. The national debt soared, and the government scrambled for ways to refill its coffers. The colonies had helped in the war effort, but from London's perspective, the Americans had not shouldered enough of the financial burden. King George III and his ministers believed that since the war protected colonial frontiers, it was only fair for colonists to help pay down the debt. This perspective, while logical to British officials, felt punitive to colonial elites and everyday citizens. They believed they had done their duty with men, supplies, and local taxes. Moreover, the colonists had grown used to a period often referred to as salutary neglect, in which British enforcement of trade laws was lax. This loose oversight allowed local self-governance to flourish. Suddenly, the passing of acts meant to raise revenue, starting with the Sugar Act of 1764, signaled the end of that freedom. The British government, in the colonists' view, was meddling in local affairs and extracting wealth without truly understanding colonial life. The phrase "no taxation without representation" became the ideological heartbeat of colonial resistance. The Stamp Act of 1765 is often cited as the moment the pot truly began to boil. This law required that all legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards carry an official stamp to prove the tax had been paid. For the first time, Parliament imposed a direct tax that directly impacted a vast range of daily colonial transactions. Lawyers, journalists, merchants, everyone felt it. Colonial assemblies loudly protested, drafting petitions to the crown, while local mobs sometimes took matters into their own hands. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization led by figures such as Samuel Adams, organized spirited demonstrations. They boycotted British goods, coerced tax collectors into resigning, and occasionally resorted to property damage. The colonial response was forceful enough that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But relief was brief. On the same day the Stamp Act was repealed, Britain issued the Declaratory Act, asserting the Crown's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In essence, Britain refused to abandon the principle that they could tax the colonies at will. The push and pull between Parliament and the colonies had officially begun. Following the Stamp Act debacle, Britain tested another approach. In 1767, the Townshend Acts placed duties on essential goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. These were indirect taxes, but colonists saw through the scheme. They recognized the Townshend Acts as another attempt to raise revenue without local input. Protests erupted anew, with non-importation agreements encouraging colonists to stop buying British goods altogether. The Daughters of Liberty, parallel to the Sons of Liberty, formed to promote the boycott of British fabrics, encouraging spinning bees and the use of homespun cloth. Tensions soared, particularly in port cities like Boston, which became a flashpoint for resistance. The presence of British troops in colonial streets inflamed the anger. Redcoats, often off-duty and seeking work, competed with local laborers, creating friction. This tension culminated in the infamous Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. Though only 5 colonists died, the event became a powerful symbol of British tyranny, fanned by propaganda from artists like Paul Revere. While some Townshend Acts were eventually repealed, the tea tax remained, serving as a provocative symbol of Parliament's insistence on control. The question lingered: how long before the colonies fully erupted in rebellion? In December of 1773, a group of colonial patriots, once again led by the Sons of Liberty, staged one of the most dramatic acts of protest, the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Mohawk Indians to symbolize their American identity, they boarded ships anchored in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea overboard. To the colonists, it was an act of defiance against an unjust tax and a demonstration that they refused to be pawns in the empire's economic strategy. The British government's response was swift and unrelenting. Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. These acts closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for, altered the Massachusetts Charter, and allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain rather than in local courts. Additionally, the Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers on demand. Far from quelling the unrest, these draconian measures galvanized the colonies into greater unity. Across the continent, from New England to the Carolinas, influential voices began calling for collective action. Patriot leaders realized that if Britain could punish Massachusetts so harshly, no colony was truly safe. The stage was set for organized resistance. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies convened in Philadelphia to discuss a unified response to the Intolerable Acts. This was the First Continental Congress. The delegates, including John Adams, Patrick Henry, and George Washington, differed on the severity of the measures needed. Some still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, while others believed conflict was inevitable. Despite these divisions, the Congress agreed on a set of rights they believed colonists were entitled to, reaffirming their loyalty to King George III but condemning Parliament's actions as unconstitutional. They established the Association, a collective boycott of British goods, and created networks of committees to enforce this boycott. This new sense of organized resistance, unprecedented in scale, signaled to Britain that the colonies were no longer a loosely connected group of distant outposts. They were cooperating for a common cause. The British response was to stand firm. King George III believed the colonies were in a state of rebellion, and he had no intention of backing down. With diplomacy fraying, each side braced for confrontation. The year 1775 arrived, and tensions in Massachusetts were at a boiling point. British troops stationed in Boston began receiving orders to disarm local militias and arrest prominent rebel leaders. Meanwhile, colonial militias, Minutemen, prepared to mobilize at a moment's notice. Rumors spread that the British planned to seize a stockpile of weapons in Concord, a town near Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops marched quietly out of the city. However, writers like Paul Revere and William Dawes lit the countryside with warnings: the British are coming. Early the next morning, a small band of Minutemen confronted the British on Lexington Green. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it echoed through history as the shot heard round the world. This skirmish spilled over into Concord, where militias clashed with the British again, forcing them to retreat. The news of bloodshed spread rapidly, igniting passions and prompting more colonists to take up arms. Reconciliation was fast becoming a distant dream, and a full-blown war was on the horizon. By May 1775, as the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia, hostilities had already erupted in Massachusetts. This time, delegates had to reckon with the reality that peaceful compromise might be slipping away. They formed the Continental Army, appointing George Washington, already respected for his leadership in the French and Indian War, to serve as commander-in-chief. While there were still voices like John Dickinson urging reconciliation, the majority understood that the lines had been drawn. Yet, they tried one last gesture of peace, the Olive Branch Petition, sent to King George III, expressing loyalty to the crown but protesting Parliament's actions. The king refused to receive it, declaring the colonies in open rebellion. As the war intensified, the atmosphere across the colonies grew more radical. Influential pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense used plain language to argue that it was illogical for an island to rule a continent, and that the time for independence was now. These radical ideas found fertile ground, further igniting the flames of revolution. During the early stages of the Revolutionary War, colonial forces saw both victories and defeats. The Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 showed that although the British ultimately claimed the hill, colonial militias could stand toe-to-toe with the world's most formidable army. This was a moral victory for the American cause and galvanized further support. Provincial assemblies began pressing their delegates in the Continental Congress to declare full independence. By 1776, the push for independence reached its peak. Fueled by fiery rhetoric from patriots like John Adams and public demand for a clean break, the Continental Congress debated the possibility of officially severing ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson emerged as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, working alongside a committee that included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence, and on July 4, the Declaration was formally adopted. This was more than a statement of separation. It was a philosophical proclamation about the rights of humankind and the responsibility of government to its people. Thus, the United States was born on paper, but the long fight for actual freedom had just begun. Once the Declaration of Independence was published, the 13 colonies were officially at war with Great Britain. The conflict, which began as a local insurrection, was now a global affair. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken its old rival, secretly funneled supplies to the Americans and eventually formed an open alliance after the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Spain and the Netherlands would also lend varying levels of support. For the colonists, the war brought severe hardships. The British Navy blockaded ports, crippling trade. Battles raged from the north to the south, and the new Continental Army often struggled with limited funds, supplies, and training. However, leadership from figures like Washington, Nathanael Greene, and others kept morale alive. Patriots fought side by side with foreign volunteers like the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben, whose expertise helped shape the ragtag militias into a more disciplined fighting force. By the early 1780s, the war swung increasingly in the Americans' favor, culminating in the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. It was a stunning outcome for what had begun as a series of protests over taxation. As we reflect on how the colonies escalated from discontented British subjects to revolutionaries, certain themes stand out. The debate over taxation struck a chord that extended beyond mere economics. It was about identity, rights, and self-determination. People who once proudly called themselves Englishmen came to see themselves as Americans, deserving of a government that respected their voice. Militant leaders like Samuel Adams and more diplomatic figures like Benjamin Franklin each played pivotal roles in their own spheres, some organizing committees of correspondence to unify the colonies, others negotiating behind the scenes in London and Paris. Events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party showcased the power of propaganda and the galvanizing effect of dramatic protests. Each new British clampdown spurred more unity across the colonies, proving that force could not extinguish the collective will of an emerging people. And so we've arrived at the end of our journey on the road to rebellion. Over the last half hour, we've traced the roots of the American Revolution, from the financial strains of the French and Indian War to the exhilarating moment the Declaration of Independence changed the course of history. We've seen how the clash of ideals, about governance, representation, and freedom, set 13 colonies on a collision path with the world's greatest empire. I hope this deep dive has illuminated not only the chronology of events, but also the human passions that shaped a movement. What started as a protest over taxes became an all-encompassing struggle for liberty, one that would ignite the imaginations of countless future generations. Thank you for joining this exploration into America's revolutionary beginnings. Don't forget to share your thoughts and questions in the comments section. Continue the conversation. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about dates and documents, it's about people daring to stand up for what they believe in.